Welcome to Chosen Conversations, where a group of friends talk about the Chosen series, what it means to us, and how it impacts our lives and proclaims the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ. Today we'll be talking about the Apostle Simon Peter, and we will be tracing him through the episodes in Season 1 as we learn more about the background story the Chosen series has created for us and his importance according to the Gospels.
In our first scene we're going to discuss today, we are going to see Peter. He's a fisherman, and he is not having very good luck catching fish, and he really needs to catch a lot of fish. And he's in the boat with Andrew, James, and John, and Zebedee, and they have been fishing all night with no luck. He's very frustrated, and here comes Jesus on the shore, and Jesus encourages him to try one more time, and he kind of gives Jesus a look like, I don't think this is going to work, and Jesus gives him a look like, try me, let's see what happens. And at that moment, the entire boat just fills with fish. Their nets are basically pulling the boat into the water, and they catch more fish than ever before. And in that moment, Peter realizes who Jesus is, his power, that he's the Son of God. And he says some very interesting things to Jesus. And we're going to discuss today what that scene means to us, some of the things he talks about with Jesus, and how this impacted Peter in his journey to follow Jesus. So John Mark, would you like to walk us through that scene, what Peter says to Jesus, and the backstory of why Peter might feel the way he does?
Thank you, Haley. When Peter sees what happens, he falls to his knees and says, go away from me. I'm a sinful man. I don't belong in your presence. He has a deep sense of his own history and his own story of sinfulness and uncleanness. Now, the Gospels don't tell us what that story is. The canonical Gospels, they don't tell us that backstory. So what the Chosen has done is they've created a backstory that fills in that hole. Because when Peter says, I'm a sinful man, are we saying, Peter, you're just like everybody else, you're not that bad? Or is Peter saying, yeah, I really am that bad. I don't belong here. Andrew maybe, but not me. And so what is it about Peter that makes him feel that way? And so the Chosen creates a backstory to give us a kind of deep sense of embrace of Peter, recognizing where he's coming from. And I think that's true for a lot of people, that when we confess that we are sinners, we don't know our backstories. And part of the backstory for Peter in the Chosen is he's a gambler. He's a violent man. He fights for money. He's aggressive with people. He's fishing on the Shabbat. He finds himself in conflict with his own friends and buddies and his own brother and his wife. He finds himself in a conflict with his wife. So he is not getting along with anybody, really. And his sense of burden of sin and his sense of how outside of the law or outside of his faith he is very deep. And so that sort of explains why in the presence of Jesus he just drops to his knees and says, I am unworthy. I'm a sinner. You don't need to be dealing with me. I'm going to contaminate you. I'm not going to be good for you. And that tells us something about his own self-image.
Yeah, while you were talking, John Mark, and Haley, your question, I was thinking about that scene you described, and it is pretty interesting that Peter doesn't respond in the typical way you think somebody would after they attempted something unsuccessfully all night. They've got to be exhausted, and they've already put up all the equipment, and somebody walks up and says, hey, why don't you try one more time, and why don't you do it right here, like near the shore where nobody ever catches anything? And, most of us probably would have said something like, you're crazy, or leave me alone, or mind your own business, or something. But the way you described that scene was so good because, Peter kind of looks at him for a second in silence, almost trying to discern, who is this? And why would you be asking me to try again? And then he just kind of says, okay, all right, we'll try it. And then he gives that look of, see, I told you nothing would happen. And then Jesus gives the little one raised eyebrow kind of look back, and then all of a sudden he's got the huge catch. And I think like what John Mark is saying, whether someone wants to get upset or not about the biblical backstory not being present, the Bible's facts have to be connected somehow. And it seems like if you caught that many fish, and James and John and Zebedee come over in the chosen episode to help because the boat's literally, like you said, being swamped because of the weight of the fish. Fishermen are going to do something with that catch. They're not just going to catch and release and turn them back into the water saying, well, that was impressive. So they probably went to market. They probably made money off of that catch. And the chosen took that to suggest that Peter was in a dire situation that Jesus then helped him miraculously get out of. And that sets up the conversation when he gets home with Eden, which I think, Haley, you had some thoughts on.
Yes. So the scene with Eden is so powerful, and it really just shows the great relationship between a husband and wife. And as John Mark shared, Eden and Peter were having some issues in their marriage because Peter just was kind of acting out. And the scene shows Eden, she's at home, squishing some grapes, making food for their family. And he comes in and says, Eden, you won't believe what just happened. And of course, with his background and his history, she may, not have believed him in the past because he wasn't necessarily showing up, being there, being a good husband, spouse to her in certain moments. But he tells her, I think I've just met the Son of God, and this is what he did, and you'll never believe this. And she reacted so beautifully. She didn't, not believe him. She didn't dismiss him. She said, this is the man that we've been praying for. And she encouraged him to follow Jesus and drop everything to follow Jesus. And she said, this man has finally seen in you what I've seen in you all along. And you are truly the man that I married. This is who I married. And so it was a beautiful, redeeming moment for their marriage, as well as the future of Peter, and just showed a supportive wife. And it kind of contradicts what we've seen in the previous episodes when Nicodemus was given that path to choose to walk in life. Whether do I follow Jesus or do I continue on with my normal everyday life and responsibilities? And we see Nicodemus's wife reminding him of all the stresses of life, the stresses of their marriage and their family. And we just see a different perspective in Eden. And I believe that as a wife, God may have, called Eden to be Peter's wife because of the calling, that the purpose that God had for Peter in his journey. So it's just a very interesting perspective of marriage. And David, I'd love to hear your perspective as well on that scene.
Yeah, that scene it's powerful in the way it turns out, where she turns around when he told me to follow him, and she turns around and starts crying, and Peter says, I know you're gonna be upset, and she said, why would I be upset? Is what we've been praying for, and he sees why I married you. Like, she knew in her heart who Peter was, and we've been talking about everyday life and about struggles and about situations. And going back to the catch, going back to the struggles that they had in their marriage and how this redeeming moment came to be, this is so true today as it was 2,000 years ago with fishermen and money debts and stuff. The number one, or maybe one of the most common reasons for divorce and marriage struggles is finances. And, in this case, they've been struggling for months, according to the background story that we're getting on The Chosen. Then Jesus shows up. The catch happens. We don't know why it happened, but in the story, in the Chosen story, they decided to pick it as a way to redeem all his debts. Then Jesus calls him to follow him. He goes home. All the debts are forgotten, and then they have this encounter where they are able to reunite and come back to a marriage where they're able to understand what each other means to them and how they're called for a bigger purpose.
I want to take it to another scene that I thought was very impactful in terms of Eden's role, where Jesus talks to Eden one-on-one and says, you and Peter are one flesh. And what Peter does is going to impact you. And I think that was a brilliant scene to put in there, because why is Peter's mother-in-law healed? Why do the Gospels even mention that? It's not just kind of one miracle out of many or something of that nature. There's something impactful about that. And I love the way The Chosen created that backstory for the healing of Peter's mother-in-law. And it's related not to Peter. The healing's not for Peter, right? The healing is for Eden, because Eden is going to sacrifice more than Peter is. I mean, Peter's called to be on the trip, all right? Eden is staying at home. And she has to struggle with the day-to-day survival of what it means to live in that economy and to live with her mother's sick. So I thought the compassion of Jesus, the recognition of Jesus that this is something that Eden needs, and that Eden is a participant in this ministry, even though she's staying home and Peter's going on the road. I thought that was a wonderful insight in terms of the healing of Peter's mother-in-law. It wasn't about Peter as much as it was about Eden and her role in the community.
It doesn't take long, and things are going so well, as David mentioned, that Peter kind of, I don't know, would you say that he has a self-assignment? That he, in an episode, they're walking along and they're traveling to the next location that they're going to, and he kind of pulls Jesus over by himself and says, hey, somebody needs to be in charge of the itinerary. Somebody needs to be in charge of communications. I'm a person who can do those things. Why don't you let me do them? And there's already a little bit of animosity between some of the other disciples at that point over why Peter would be chosen, and maybe Peter thinking, why wouldn't he be chosen? And so we see a little bit of different personality of Peter come out. He's overcome the I'm not worthy. Now I kind of am trying to self-assign what I need to do inside here. Does that resonate with anybody?
Yes, I think that's his personality coming out, right? He's this aggressive person. He's this, we're going to fight for this, we're going to get this done. Even at the wedding when he says, okay, let's do this, we got the fish and we got the wine, let's get this done. And then Jesus responds with, we'll see. Basically, we'll see how you do with that, Peter. But yeah, I think that strong sense of leadership, which is coming out in negative ways here. I mean, there are positive dimensions to that leadership, but there are negative dimensions to it in terms of the way he's asserting himself. He's assuming that he has to protect Jesus, that he's got to marshal the people around to get this done. And that's a problem. And it does create the friction that we're going to see all the way through of these episodes, the friction among the disciples. And a lot of it has to do, okay, who's going to be the leader, right? And that's going to be a struggle among the disciples.
John Mark, I love what you just said about that, because I think The Chosen does an awesome job of just showing each character with their own personality, their own flaws. It's very raw. And when you think about these characters and all coming together to follow Jesus, first of all, he chose people that might not have been, you would have thought would have been chosen. He chose people that had flaws, normal people like you and I. He chose, people that had disabilities, or he chose people that, were good leaders and bad leaders and just fishermen. He chose a various number of people to do his will. We saw with Mary, someone who was an alcoholic, someone who was demon-possessed, that was basically at the end of her rope when he chose her to follow him. It just shows us when you get a group of people together of faith working together, there's going to be a lot of conflicting personalities and they have to learn to work together. But that's a beautiful thing that's visualized in The Chosen.
David, how do you see that relationship between the disciples at this point in season 1? What are you seeing in those conversations and relationships?
Well, yeah, you can see that there's some sense of friendship among James, John, and Andrew and Peter. I mean, they're all fishermen, so they work together and they know how to handle each other and work together. But as they get more disciples in the group, and some are having to struggle with how Peter handles situations sometimes, then yeah, there's some animosity there towards him because of his natural leadership that at times can be seen as negative. But anyway, what I do love about the show and about Peter and how it portrays it is that I've never really thought about Peter as a person, as a man. And now that you put a picture to the letters that he wrote and to the character that is described in the Gospels, it just makes it easier to relate and to see the reality that Peter and I are not that much different. Like, he was called and he had struggles. He was a sinful man, as we go back to the scene at the boat, and he knew it. And so do I. And I know my only way out is Jesus.
Yeah, we see a lot of leaders who are aggressive, who are controlling, and I see that emerging in Peter here. He's pushing Jesus, and he's managing things, and he's protecting, and so he has this strong, aggressive characteristic that is controlling in some way. And Jesus is gently not letting him control, right? But still, Peter has that impulse. And I think there are a lot of leaders like that we need to see ourselves in Peter, say, oh, yeah, that aggressiveness, that's not going to work. And that's not what Jesus is really after here.
Yeah, as you guys were talking, I heard two interesting concepts. We talked earlier about the contrast of how he didn't react this way when Jesus asked him to throw the net on the other side of the boat. But it seems like he often does have knee-jerk reactions that are his back's up against a wall, or he's got himself in a little bit of a jam, and he's got some sort of scheme or some sort of high-energy way to get out of it, right? But Haley said it, and John Mark said it too. You said control. I find it fascinating that from the scene where he says, "Depart from me, I'm an unclean person, I'm an unclean man," but as Jesus heals people and redeems parts of them, it seems like that's when they start thinking that instead of following the one who actually is in control of everything, they need to be in control. And they did that. I didn't see it until you guys were talking, but they show that. Peter goes from somebody who's very yielding and very, very agreeable to try the net on the other side to now needing to be somebody who's almost repaying Jesus for the love he's given him by trying to protect him and trying to be in control, when really he needs to always let Jesus be in control. But to David's point, don't we all do a little bit of that as Peter ourselves? So,
yeah, and you see it in his relationship with the Romans. I mean, Peter is kind of has the spotlight in the chosen in terms of the animosity toward Romans. And it might even be part of his violent streak that he says, okay, we're going to beat these guys, right? We're going to defeat the Romans. And that's part of what it means to be Messiah. And I'm going to follow you in that. And I'll go to the ends of the earth with you. And that's when Jesus says, yeah, we'll see. But yeah, that impulse of control is also almost a violent one, right? Because Peter's the one who takes the sword out and cuts off Malchus's ear in the Garden of Gethsemane. So we see him, the chosen is giving us this picture of Peter that I think is very consistent with the biblical story of a person who wants to even violently protect Jesus, as if Jesus needed that.
Yeah, and that animosity towards the Romans really kind of comes out in taxes as well. He really doesn't like the fact that Matthew is one of them, is a Jew that has decided to work for the Roman government. And I think in one scene, I don't remember exactly which one it is, they get into a heated argument, and he basically just tells Matthew that it's his fault, that his taxes, somebody posted a picture that said, was Matthew the tax collector for Peter and Andrew based on where they lived in Capernaum, right? And the Bible doesn't tell us, but John Mark, from your archaeology and New Testament studies, I mean, they're all from Capernaum, right? And if he was the tax collector, there's a high probability he could have been the tax collector for them. And maybe that's another reason that Peter really doesn't like Matthew. Once Jesus calls him at the end of season 1.
Well, that's certainly possible. I mean, there are probably a number of tax collectors in Capernaum, not just one, but we don't really know. Well, we really don't know. But for the storytelling of the chosen to have that backstory between Matthew and Peter pays dividends in the telling of the story, because we can imagine what that relationship was possibly like, because we know what it's like to be with people that we've recently reconciled with, or we really have some problem with, and now they're in our community or they're in our small group, and how are we going to deal with that? And that's what we see. So, I mean, take us to that scene, if you would, of Matthew and Peter and Jesus calling Matthew and how Peter reacts to that.
Yeah, so they're back in Capernaum, walking through the streets, and there's Matthew in his booth, and Jesus stops, turns around, looks at Matthew and says, "Follow me." And Matthew leaves the booth, and there's an interaction there with his guard, telling him, "Why are you leaving? You have everything. You have all the money you need." And he gives him the key and just follows Jesus. And during that scene, there's Peter talking to Jesus, whispering to his ear, "Do you know who that is? Are you serious?" We can be questioning that. And sometimes we are Matthew on the other end, being the ones being called into the kingdom.
Well, that's such a good point, David. I really appreciate that. To think about, okay, who am I in this story? Which is part of the joy of watching Chosen is to say, okay, who am I in this story? Who would I be like? Would I be like Peter saying, "Jesus, you don't know this guy. You don't know what this guy's done." He's talking to Jesus, who Jesus knew what Peter had done. And Peter is so blinded by his hatred of the Romans and his hatred of taxation from the Romans and the oppression of the Romans, which we could understand, being an oppressed people. Those who are oppressed, you can understand the kind of hatred that they would have. But he's so blinded by that he can't compare himself to Matthew. When, in fact, where we began in this podcast is Peter began with, "I'm unworthy. I'm a sinner. I don't deserve to be in your presence." And now he's taken up the role of saying, "Hey, Matthew doesn't deserve this." It's like the elder brother, it's when the prodigal comes home, the older brother says, "We can't do this. This is not good." I see that in that kind of relationship between Peter and Matthew.
I do as well. And how many times do we question what God does in our lives? And how many times do we not understand things? Like, I feel like Peter in that moment was very raw. Like, why in the world would you choose Matthew to follow you? Like, look at what he's done. Look at where he's been. Look at what he does for a living. And we can't question God's will. And I believe that every single one of these disciples were chosen for unique reasons. I'm really excited for our discussion in our next episode about Matthew, because we will, talk about his personality, his uniqueness. And Matthew actually has been speculated to be on the autistic spectrum and displayed that way in this series. And so it's so unique how they could have used Matthew in this way just to show how God uses each of us uniquely. And just remember that, like you said, John Mark, we might not all understand or like each other in our faith or in our congregation small groups, but we're not in charge. We're not in control of determining God's will, and God can use us all together for his unique purpose. So I hope that in upcoming episodes, we'll see that Peter and Matthew can come together and see that they do have a lot in common with following Jesus and doing his will, and can get along a little bit better.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful, Haley. I think that's true. And Stan, let me bring you in here as we conclude. You remember what Peter said to Jesus when Jesus was saying, "I know him. I know Matthew. And I knew you too, when I called you." And then Peter says, "But this is different. It's always true with those. This is different. It's not like that. I'm just like this. This is different. And Stan, take us out with what Jesus said.
So yeah, Jesus says, get used to different. And that becomes a tagline. I even have one of the t-shirts that says that. And I think really to John Mark's points and David's and Haley's, just the small groups or the congregations or whatever, it seems like the differences that everybody has, and yet the unity that people have the opportunity and the invitation to have in Christ, we see in the disciples. And we'll see it as the chosen continues to unfold. And next time when we talk about Matthew, it really kind of heightens, without foreshadowing that too much, just that there's a bunch of different people here. There's a bunch of different personalities. And to John Mark's point, once you have the love of Jesus and you feel like you're in good standing, it's really unfortunate how the human tendency is to look at others and then immediately say, well, they're disqualified. So I love that statement by Jesus, get used to different. We're doing things differently. It's not what you guys think it's going to be. It's not this violent kingdom that's going to overthrow the Romans. We're going to overthrow them, but we're going to do it in a loving, peaceful way, and they don't yet understand that.
Well, it's been a good conversation. Grateful for everyone. Haley, David, Stan. May the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the communion of the Holy Spirit be with us all. Amen.